Well, let's try. Today is December the 10th. This is our first meeting. In attendance is Ann Funk, Betty Fisher, Edna Corley, Nancy Faust, and Jan Worthington. I think one of the first things we want to explore today is who we want to interview. Edna, you had some ideas on this.
Contact Jewel Graham because she is world president of the YWCA, and I think it would be interesting to have her whole background from Clark Street to where she is today.
How about some of the, of course, this. I was wondering about some of the early employees of the YWCA. Are there any of those available?
Cassie Cook was one of the first black administrators in the YWCA, and she lives at Wilberforce, and I think she might be able to give you some input as to how they began their work after we were up to, after Clark Street left and came up to the YWCA on High Street.
Ann, do you have any contacts? Now, I understand your mother goes way back, Mrs. Emery Ballantyne. Would she have anything available for us?
I don't know. She claims herself that she doesn't remember dates anymore, but at the same time, there might be something that we could come up with if we talked with her ahead of time as to what might be her remembrance of some of the things that she had done in the old days.
I'm sure she has some very colorful stories to tell, some human interest stories, which will make it very interesting in written form. How about you, Nancy?
Well, my grandmother, Mrs. Susan E. Davies, was one of the 7 women who began the YW. It was started because there were so many young women coming into town to work at the in the stores and in the factories, and the ladies were much concerned that these unchaperoned young ladies should have a place to live. Now, this history talks about a residence on East Columbia Street, but I never remember hearing my grandmother talk about that. She talked about the one that was on West High Street at 98 West High Street. She talked about that, and I always thought that was the first YW. Then in later years, after World War II, my mother became the residence director at the YW. And then during the Depression, they combined the residence and the buildings manager, and Mother did that job until she retired in the 1940s.
We have some additional names to add, people that need to be interviewed. And who are they, Ann?
Elizabeth Woodhouse would be one. Sherry Osborg would be another one. We mentioned Priscilla Smithers, but perhaps she wasn't there long enough to make a difference, or that she would have enough to offer.
Do you remember the one gal who worked as secretary down there? Her name was Dolores.
Ford.
Dolores Ford. I saw her Sunday during the tour of homes, and we couldn't remember right at that moment how we knew each other. Then we reminisced and remembered.
What about Eve Fry? She was our instructor at the swimming pool for years. So Eve would be a good one, I would think.
We will probably be able to get a lot of information about Clark Street from Gertrude Carter Smith, who was president at one time at the Branch Y.
How long ago does Geneva Studebaker go? I remember she was on the board when I came on the board.
She didn't stay very long. But Eve,
Did we? I guess we mentioned Eve Fry, didn't we?
yes. Frida Terry. What about Frida Terry? Oh. Oh. She might have taught a golf class or two, but that was about it, I think.
There's a PIC planning committee there that was planning one of the 8th annual meetings or some annual meeting we were having. I think we should contact some of those people. Yeah, there's a picture there with
There's Dorothy Elliott and in this picture planning this annual meeting. I don't know what year. Is Dorothy Elliott and Nan Gray. And Mrs. Frank Worthington. And Mrs. Sidney Corley. How about Mrs. Charles Terry? Is that the one? Who's Mrs. James Bradhurst? Elaine. Okay. Mrs. David Duff. Estelle. Okay. Then, of course, Mrs. Pence. But then there's Mrs. Mitchell, who of course is gone.
Well, if I'm in that picture, this has to be about 69 or 70. Because that's when I moved to Springfield, was in 69. Okay, that must be 1970. Well, I can certainly remember all those luncheons we used to get ready for at noon. The foreign luncheons, yes. And
And you remember I think we should contact Bonnie Nelson, who worked so with the gourmet luncheons that we had at the YWCA. And she also contributed a lot to the teenage programs that we had. Ada McGuire worked with us during the time we was doing the action audit when the YWCA nationally was taking a stand to eliminate racism wherever it existed by any means necessary, which frightened everybody in the United States.
Now, Judy and I made one of the former physical education directors was in town last month, Harriet Stewart. She's retired from Ohio Wesleyan University and lives in Burlington, North Carolina. Now, Ginny, my daughter, and I may possibly be going down to see her in the spring, and if so, perhaps I could take a tape recorder with me and talk to her. She, let's see, about the times that she was there. Mother retired in the 1940s, and it was just prior to that Harriet was at the Y. So it would have been in the 1940s that she was there.
Edna, you had some interesting comments about
Mrs. Hugh Taylor was one of the early founders of the Clark Street branch, and she would be able to contribute an awful lot to the growth of the YWCA and the success of especially women coming together, as imperative was stated in the early 70s at the national level, because she always believed in all women working together as Christians, and that was one of the things that we were trying to do, and yet we encompassed all women to work, and it's a great loss that we don't have her, but we cherish her memory.
I'm wondering, girls, should we establish how far back can we go in time? You think we can go clear back to the founding, that we can actually get some history?
Yes, we have gone back as far as 1896, and I think that was the beginning of Mrs. Davies, who was the first president of the 7 women that started the YWCA, and I think we have recorded history of that because we had done research under the leadership of some of the women whose parents and grandparents was part of this institution that has been so great throughout the world. So I think we are able to give to you all and most of the accomplishments we have had in the YWCA. And I don't think we need to hesitate to take the history that was compiled for us for the 75th anniversary and use it, because it was very well done and certainly appreciated by the community when we gave it out at the 75th anniversary.
Back to where you were.
When I first came to the YWCA, my training came from Mrs. Sue James, who had been the executive at the YWCA, and then she met the the owner of the James Lumber Company, and she married him. But she was working as a volunteer and gave me my training. It was called the Little Red Schoolhouse. And that's how I began in the YWCA, caught the spirit, and stayed for 38 years. Yeah, I still have it. Yeah, I'm still working with the Council of YWCAs. And this year I served as nominating committee. To me, the greatest loss to the YWCA in Springfield was that we lost a laboratory for women. And I have had the opportunity to work with women from all over the world that was presidents of YWCAs. You learn that all women are women just alike, seeking the same things for their families and for their communities and for world peace. And I do hope that in the hearts of women in Springfield, wherever they serve, that they will do as I do, keep the spirit of the YWCA alive by still extending to younger women that they can always lift their sights. There are fights, but you can't give up. And we have to keep building on what has been given us as a foundation from the YWCA in Springfield in 1896. Because going into the 21st century, a lot of these foundations are going to mean an awful lot. And that is why I stay a member of the Council of the YWCA, in order to keep abreast as how things are moving, that what little bit that I might give back to my community in other agencies will still be a part of the spirit of the YWCA that was started here so many years ago.
that it was the YWCA, that is the branch, was started that early. Because I was a member of the branch in 1923 and was a Girl Reserve. Attended Girl Reserve conferences out of state. But as I remember, Ann Arnold, I believe, was she not the first secretary? And Ann came after 1925. About that time. Y Street branch was? Well, I found a clipping in my scrapbook of the death of Lydia Harris. She was the first president of the Board of Management of the branch. And in her obituary, it said that she was one of the founders, and it gave some dates within that obituary. 19 and 37. Yes. I have April the 6th, 1937. So I believe that is the date of the
group and a pre-teenage group, and they began to have little play. I remember taking my baby and going to see some of the programs that they had. I don't think we had an executive up there after that, because that is when the men in the community said they could not afford to support 3 Ys, and they wanted in the community said they could not afford to support 3 Ys, and they wanted us to move in with the men. And their philosophy and our philosophy was not the same at the time. So the women on High Street, who were board members, and as I remember, Mrs. Pence, Mrs. Winwood, Mrs. Kent, and Miss Baker decided that the women was going to keep their philosophy and go up on High Street, and I think that was in 1950.
back. You see, after Mother left, we were never too much in touch with the Y, and that was in the 1940s, you see. Mother gradually couldn't see and became worse and things like that. And I was trying to keep the family together and working, and so I didn't see much of the Y, so I really don't know too much about it after then, after before the 1940s. Of course, it was always an organization that was important in our family because my grandmother was always so interested in it. One of the interesting things that happened coming over to Rennes to work was a little German woman by the name of Minnie Elschlager. And Minnie had left a large family and come here to live, and she was lonely. And she was living down at the Y, and she would talk to my grandmother every once in a while and complain about how lonesome it was over here and so on. So grandmother was a great one for taking people in, and so she took Minnie in to live with us, and she lived with us until she retired, and she was always just like one of the family. And so you see, my knowledge about the Y, much of it goes back before 1940. We lived, after Mother became the buildings manager, we moved into the Y, she and I did. My grandmother was gone by that time. And also Miss Elschlager went with us, because she was like one of the family. And So I lived down there, and it was a good place to live. It was an interesting place. There was always the swimming pool and the classes going on and things like that for a young girl. I enjoyed it. But after the 1940s, my very particular knowledge of Hawaii kind of stops. Well, it must have been in the 1930s. I'm trying to think.
I can remember your mother as being around a lot.
Yes, see, I graduated from college in 1932, and it was between then and the 1940s, when Mother retired, that I was there at the Y.
It was to begin with. It was the what do I want to say? The basis or the beginning of a place to meet for newcomers coming to town. And Mrs. Cooper was the one who started that. And then it developed from there. And I don't remember really how long they were at the Y. But that was the idea. We took care of people who had just moved into the area, and yeah. So. Uh-huh. Phyllis Edwards would know about the fortnightly. She might be another possibility to talk to about that, because it did actually start there.
I noticed in the morning paper that there is going to be a fortnightly group meet, and anyone's invited to come. And you know, I'm not familiar. The only one I knew was Merle Thrasher, and of course she's gone. But it's a music group. Yes, we had planned on this. I think this little intimate group is certainly a productive group, and I think this is the way that we must go.
One thing our thoughts were, you all, of course, we become a big body of experience, and we know who else is peripheral, such as Phyllis Edwards and Carol Mullen.
Does anyone else have any comments at this time they would like to make? Is there one of the other points that we thought we would touch on, and we've talked about the cooperative agencies, we've just talked about that. Were there any competing agencies?
What about the YWCA?
That's the only one that I
Amen.
remember. Were there any other organizations that really gave the Y problems?
I don't think so.
Just the YM.
I think so. We were definitely in competition with them.
They were the money bag.
Yeah, they were.
So would you say that this was the group that gave us hostility? Oh, okay.
That does give us an idea of the role of women at that time. Still was not a role of equality, a role of their presence as a leadership group in the city.
Interestingly enough, the YM used to, the gals who went over to the YM left the YW for various reasons. The one thing they would comment on would be our fee structure in comparison to the YN. because you joined by the year, and then you were able to partake of all these classes. And our membership, I remember way back when, was $3 a year.
Oh, yeah, it says so in some of these.
And then you paid for your classes individually. But of course, our idea was that there were people who were not interested in going a whole year to the Y for classes, which was actually where your comparison came. And so we just did it as the individual could take care of it. But the YM did not operate that way. They went with the bigger fee and the year for the year. So we had always were interpreting what our membership meant in comparison to the YM.
Well, I have to tell you, I got my innings in all the time about the YM.
Tell us about it.
I can't remember what it was, but of course I was there and listened to a great deal that went on about the YM and the YW. But one time, it was, I don't know when it was, maybe 20, 25 years ago, the Reverend George Marshall was the rector of our church, and he was invited to come down to the YM to talk about something. Now, what in the world we were going to talk about, I don't know. But he asked me to go along with him. So I went down, and all these holier-than-thous sitting down there, you know, and talking so pontifically. And finally, I said to them, well, there's just one question I'd like to ask you. How is it that you claim to be a Christian organization, but you separate the races? You have the downtown YMCA, and you have the Center Street YMCA. How does that happen? I never got an answer, and I bet George wished he hadn't taken me. But I thought, shades of my mother and all those other gals that worked so hard for the Y and got so little for it. I had to say it. I didn't get any answer.
One thing we haven't touched on too much is what was the source of funding other than our $3 membership fee. And I, of course, was not associated with the YW until later years, 69 and 70, but I always remember we were a very poor group and always struggling, and when we did have our foreign luncheons, and I know I went out and just begged people to buy tickets, and Don Bishop was always such a help. I would call Don, and he'd always buy 10 tickets from me and send everyone from the bank for lunch. And I know he took it out of his petty cash or something, but he was always so helpful, as he is for everything in the community now. But what were some of our sources of funding?
First, started community chest. Yeah. First, we was funded by the community chest, and then the United Appeals, and now the United Way. We went through 3 changes since I've been there. I've been there 40 years. Isn't that terrible? That's a long time. When I started off, I got my training, too, to work with the community chest from Betty Pitzer, who also was a YWCA worker. And she told us she was going to make us professional people to know how to go out and get money. And I have said this in a meeting at the United Way last year, that it was time for me to step down from where I was, but I wanted to thank Betty Pitzer for making me a professional volunteer.
Maybe it's time you train some people to be
Oh.
professional volunteers and go out and get the money.
Oh, I couldn't do like Betty. She was very good at showing you how to go to the homes, and then we was doing door-to-door canvassing to housewives.
Yes, we did the fiddling.
That's right.
Would you like to comment on that anymore, Ann, on the funding?
I think we should talk a little bit about the program that we started at the end of our program. I remember I looked at that Facebook holiday for wives or whatever. Ann started that program, and I'd like for her to speak to you about it, because that became a national program too, and all the programs of YWCA throughout the United States.
I was going to say, let's take a look at that. Just to, yeah. Um, Why don't you turn that thing off a minute? Why holiday? I can't remember why. Oh, holiday. Oh, I get you. Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's, remember Helen Mulholland took that up and she took it to the national board meeting as a staff person, and it was in all the, they still have those programs.
Oh, yes.
YWCAs are still using those
Yeah,
today.
right. Women's Day out,
Right.
whatever.
Well, you started that program.
Well,
So you should mention something about it, because the things that we went to the world meeting, and your mother spoke so beautifully about the early history. They was very much, here I go again.
that's right, you're here, Edna.
In September, the 7 life members of the YWCA was invited to the World YWCA meeting in Dayton, Ohio. They dedicated a building called the Women's Center, which if the new YM ever goes up, we're going to have a women's center in there if I'm alive. And if not, I hope whoever's hearing this recording, if you ever do anything for me, see that they have a women's center run by women in the YMCA Family Y. Thank you. But what I would like to say, that we were given history of different YWCAs, and I did not know that Springfield YWCA nationally was listed as an inactive YWCA. So we had Ann's mother there, who was one of the oldest board members, and she got up and talked about the history of the YWCA just beautifully, and the women from the World YWCA were so impressed that they thought some of them could live that long and still be that active in a YWCA somewhere. And this is when we found out that Jewel Graham had become World YWCA president. So we do have history. In 1906, we were a part of the national board. We were invited to come because of Mrs. Davies, and I think these things should be remembered in Springfield and should be carried on in Springfield by women.
And do you have a copy of your mother's talk that she made at that time?
No, it was just an extemporaneous speech.
I remember something.
She just was so impressed with the young women that was carrying on the YWCA throughout the world, that when they asked her to speak, and we were just so proud of her, and Lawson and I was just beaming because, and so was Jean Hogle, who started her career in Springfield as a teenage president. She was there in Cincinnati. We were very happy to be invited, and certainly she represented us.
As I was looking in this book, I remembered the Traveler's Aid. That was carried on by the YW, and my mother did it. And mother would go down to the Traveler's Aid people would let her know, and she would go down to the train station and meet these people and provide for them. The only thing that would get mother's goat was that there were a couple of very well thought of families in Springfield who had a couple of